When I am laid in earth, let my wrongs create no trouble in thy breast. Remember me, but forget my fate. Hello and welcome to Music Theory for the month of March. We are in the middle of the Lenten season, and so I had a lot of sort of doleful and sorrowful choral pieces going through my head, and as a result of that, I picked out a really neat topic to show you guys today. This is a harmonic device called the Passus Duriusculus. Now, the piece that you just heard me singing, that was actually just a little snippet. I did a little bit from the beginning, and then I actually skipped to the end because I didn't want to do the whole piece. That is a very famous aria. It is titled When I Am Laid in Earth, and it is from the opera Dido and Aeneas by Henry Purcell, who lived 1659 to 95. So early Baroque, although Purcell in some ways was more retrospective. He came out of a tradition of late Renaissance Elizabethan composers. So anyway, that particular piece is the Queen of Carthage, Dido. It's also called Dido's Lament. So she's dying and she's talking to her maidservant Belinda. Is it Belinda or Melinda? Well, I think it's Belinda. And she's basically, it's just this wondrous lament as she is dying. And Aeneas, her erstwhile lover, has left and is going off to found the city of Rome, as the legend goes. So anyway, it's this wonderfully tragic, lugubrious piece. And the reason why I was singing it for you is because it features the topic of today's lesson, which is the Passus Duriusculus. Take a listen, and maybe you'll start to form an idea of what this harmonic device is. So here was the beginning. Especially that left hand. Hear that motion? Passus means passage. Duriusculus means difficult or strenuous. So it refers to a motif, a harmonic motif, that was used from the late Renaissance until the present day, consisting of descending chromatic half steps in the bass. So, for example, in our piece When I Am Laid in Earth by Henry Purcell, we have it in G minor, and so oftentimes this figure will start on the tonic and it will descend in half steps. Typically, the usual definition is that it descends through the span of a perfect fourth. So if it were to start on the tonic, it will descend to the dominant. So, for example, we have G minor, then we had the F sharp, then we would have an F natural, E natural, na, E flat, na, na, and our D. And of course, the D being the fifth, remember it's a fourth down from G, but it's the fifth of the key of G, or G minor. The D being the dominant, or the fifth, is going to, by its very nature, propel us back to the tonic, which is G minor in this case. So the Passus Duriusculus is a descending chromatic passage in the bass that tends to present itself in cyclic form because upon reaching the dominant, the harmony is naturally propelled back to the tonic. So it often appears in repeating what we call ground bass patterns. So in the Renaissance and Baroque, there are two basic kinds of bass lines. One of them is called a basso continuo, which means that, sort of like the name implies, continuo means continuous. So it's kind of a continuously changing bass line. And the other one is the ground bass that actually repeats the same pattern. The most famous ground bass is, of course, Pachelbel's Canon, which is going to repeat this 8-note figure throughout the entire piece. Restart. So the Passus Duriusculus often takes a similar form in terms of it being cyclic. So, the reason why it's called the difficult passage, well, I expect it probably has to do with the emotional context with which this device was typically used, or the emotional context that it tends to create or imply. Because by nature of going in half steps, you're going to be creating some really interesting suspensions, and especially depending on the way you harmonize it in the other voices, there's going to be a good amount of tension. And there's also going to be this sort of unique quality of sadness and melancholy because of the descending half steps. So, for example, that F sharp will tend to pull that B flat out of its position, right? Now the F will want to pull down towards the E. That's maybe more of a brighter, sweeter sound. And then those last two, the E flat to the D, for those of you who are interested, that actually creates what we call a Phrygian cadence. It sounds really complicated and weird, but it's actually not that bad. And you actually hear them. You hear Phrygian cadences pretty much every day in many different contexts, whether you know it or not. The Phrygian cadence is effectively just a half-step cadence where the bass goes from the lowered sixth to the fifth. So it's anything that has that sound. Da-dum. And it doesn't have to be all fancy and classical sounding. It could be, it could be in a rock song. It could be in a hip-hop song. They're all over the place. But anyway, that Phrygian cadence does appear at the end of the Passus Duriusculus. It's the last two notes. Right? So let's go through and look at a few examples of this technique throughout history so that we get a better sense of how to hear it, the different ways it can be harmonized, the different ways it can be used, and how to recognize it. So I have a handy-dandy list. Where is it, though? Ah, yes, here it is. Okay, so the motif starts out in the late Renaissance being used by the so-called Madrigalists, who are composers that are, primarily composing madrigals. And madrigals are really well known for their emotion, their expressiveness, in somewhat contrast to the sacred music of the Renaissance, which, I mean, you do have some expression, but it's more solemn, and it's more about focusing on the prayer or the worship involved, and less about, look at me, I'm so dramatic, or listen to this amazing romantic statement, or listen to me, wax poetic about this woman or man or whatever. So the madrigals are where you get that really flowery, expressive kind of sort of the classic. When you think of Renaissance and you think of this birth of this liberty of expression, well, that's the madrigals is where you have that for the most part. And so you can understand why the Madrigalists just couldn't resist the pulling and the tension and the sort of melancholy and drama of the Passus Duriusculus. So it starts off with the Madrigalists in the late Renaissance. One great example that is right on the cusp from the Renaissance to the Baroque period is a wonderful composer, one of my all-time favorites, Monteverdi, or Claudio Monteverdi, which just means Green Mountain, so I always call him the Green Mountain Boy. But anyway, Monteverdi was a very innovative composer who started to use those madrigalist sort of dramatic techniques in sacred choral works. Now, I'm not saying he's the first one that ever did this, but he is one of the main proponents of this style. And so this is right around 1610, and this is basically right on the cusp where we're transitioning into what's known as the Baroque period. And that Baroque period is going to be characterized by greater range of affect and emotion within, pieces or movements compared to the Renaissance, and denser harmony, more chromaticism. And so Monteverdi is one of the pivotal figures in this change. And so he's going to take this Passus Duriusculus and apply it to a liturgical setting, a sacred piece. And the piece that I had in mind, it's not even really a very well-known Monteverdi piece, but it's a Crucifixus that he wrote for 4 voices. The Crucifixus is a section of the Nicene Creed, or the profession of faith, in the Christian or Catholic faith. And it's the section of that prayer which says, "And he was crucified for us under Pontius Pilate. He suffered, died, and was buried." So that's Crucifixus etiam pro nobis sub Pontio Pilato, passus et sepultus est. Actually, technically, it doesn't say he died, kind of fun theological point of debate. It actually just says he suffered and was buried. But anyway, as you can see from that text, it's obviously going to be a very solemn moment. But Monteverdi is going to give it this very dramatic treatment with the chromatic Passus Duriusculus that we are talking about. So he sets it sort of like this. One voice starts, crucifixus etiam. Now listen to the second voice. Same thing, right? I can't obviously sing all the voices at once, but it's basically an imitative treatment where one voice comes in with that descending na 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 na, and the other one comes in na na, and then the supporting voices come in at different pitches. It's not all the exact same thing, and it just creates this beautiful sort of cyclic and very hypnotic texture that just sort of pulls you in and really takes you for a ride. So that's Monteverdi around the beginning of the 17th century. And then we have the piece that I played for you at the beginning, Dido's Lament, also sometimes known as When I Am Laid in Earth by the first line of the text. And that's Purcell. Purcell, like I may have mentioned, was, even though he lived during the Baroque period, he lived during the reign of Mary II of England, of William and Mary fame. Even though he lived during that time, he was very much in the tradition of the older composers, the Elizabethan composers of the late 16th and early 17th centuries, and so. And part of that is because England, being an island, always lagged behind some of the traditions of the continent. As you might imagine, trends were happening in Italy that didn't reach England for 50 or 100 years. So that's why Purcell, by maybe 1680 or 1690, is just now getting around to doing this Passus Duriusculus thing. But he does it so beautifully. Listen to the suspensions here. So this one's in G minor. So you have... Hear that? So it's in G minor. G, A, B flat. Now that B flat is going to hold while the bass moves to F sharp. That interval between F sharp and B flat is a diminished fourth for you music theory nerds out there. And that is going to want to resolve very strongly. Then he sets the next bass note, the F, as a third inversion dominant chord, which has this nice leading tone in the top. That resolves beautifully to that sweet C major chord. So that may have been a bit much, but what that was, it's basically just a 5-1 in C major. Now remember, we started in G minor. So what happens with this progression is that because it moves through every half step between point A and point B, it creates a lot of opportunities to visit sort of other keys, other related keys. So we start out in G minor, we have that F sharp. Now we have this little cadence that sounds like it's in C major, doesn't it? It sounds like Dido. That's with the E in the bass, right? The E being part of C major. But that's going to quickly go away with that E flat. Now we have our Phrygian cadence that I talked about. Now Purcell adds a little gesture at the end before he repeats. Etc. So Purcell is now adding these beautiful suspensions, these momentary dissonances that interact with the bass line, the na 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 na, in order to create even more tension and even more drama. for the character of Dido in this wonderful opera. And so moving forward, I'm basically going chronologically and showing you some examples in history. Moving forward in history, we have one of the most well-known composers of all time, J.S. Bach, and he absolutely loves this figure. And he clearly was paying attention to my boy Monteverdi 100 years earlier, when Monteverdi had his Crucifixus with the Passus Duriusculus in the voices. And here comes Bach. Listen to his Crucifixus. Take a listen to the bass line. Sound familiar? So he's taking that. I bet you that he knew of the Monteverdi piece. Of course, there were probably many other pieces that used this technique that he could have been inspired by. But the fact that it's a Crucifixus and it has the exact same bass line tells me that there may have been a link there. So listen to the way Bach sets the voices over top of this bass line. It's really neat. He's going to use these momentary dissonances. And one thing to listen for is when he's on the first note, he's actually not going to use this chord, da, da, da. He's actually going to use na, na, na. And that's going to create this beautiful sort of sighing motif. Na, 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 where the voices are able to fall down by half step, almost imitating the bass. So take a listen to that. You have Crucifixus, let's see. Fixus and etc., etc. Right? I'm bouncing around from tenor, from different parts, alto, bass, soprano, but you get the idea. That bass line serves as the sort of what's the word? I'm trying not to say bass because I just said bass, but that bass line serves as the building block off of which these other descending, sighing figures, often in half steps, na, na, crucifix, off of which all of those are based. And when you put it all together, it just forms this glorious, interwoven, polyphonic texture. So Bach was a master of the Passus Duriusculus, again, combining those techniques that we saw with the Madrigalists, with Monteverdi, with Purcell, and, of course, many other composers that I don't even have time to even name. But yeah, and Bach used those techniques to no end in his keyboard and in other instrumental works as well, perhaps even more than in his choral stuff. So that happens, those techniques pop up in the Well-Tempered Clavier, the Preludes and Fugues, a lot of those kind of pieces. And then right around the same time as Bach, I just wanted to show you another example that I just think is really, really beautiful. It's not necessarily terribly different than the other ones, but this is by Bach's contemporary Arcangelo Corelli, who was, as you can probably tell, was an Italian composer of the High Baroque period, so right around 1700. And he is very well known for his concerti, his violin concertos, or string concertos. So there's 12 in particular that are really well known. That's Opus 6. And one of my favorites is the Concerto in D major, which is Opus 6, number 4. You have to specify these things because some of these guys wrote many concerti in D major, so you can't just say Concerto in D major. You have to say Opus 6, number 4. But the middle movement, he's got this Adagio. Let me see if I can reproduce this for you. This is just absolutely stunning. So you have... So it's going to be in B minor, which is the relative of D major. So oftentimes middle movements, soft movements of concerti will often be in a relative minor. So let's see if I can reproduce this for you. Now listen for the bass. Sorry. It almost seems like a crime to stop playing it. It's so lovely. But the important part was right at the beginning. You have these slow moving chords. And that, of course, is almost a textbook interpretation of the technique in question, the Passus Duriusculus. That's in B minor, so you have B minor. Now this is F sharp major over A sharp. And then, of course, every time you have a sharp, which then becomes a natural, that always feels melancholy. Take a listen. Right? There's just no two ways around it. So that's why this technique has the unique pull that it does, or the unique melancholy, because you have, for example, the tonic, and then you have the next note will be the leading tone, which is sharp. And then just by virtue of the way the device goes, it'll then be lowered in the next one. Same thing happens on the next pair. You have this maybe brighter sound. Well, the way I voiced it was kind of dark, but if you voice it like that, brighter, and then it suddenly becomes minor, right? So it's these pairs. It's just stunning. So I highly encourage you to take a listen to Corelli's Concerti Grossi, which just means big concertos. Especially that Opus 6, number 4. I will make sure to post a list of all the pieces I am referencing so that you can listen to them. They're all stunning pieces, and all worth listening to.